Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Netflix Stories Festival. Thank you so much also to Ed Balls, who's come here to talk about his wonderful memoir and book about food, Appetite. So on the back of this wonderful book, which I've read this week, which is part memoir, part cookbook, I love the back and the sleeve. It describes you as a dad, cook, pianist, economist, writer, chairman, retired dancer, and cabinet minister. And it is this incredible energy and appetite for life that seeps off every page, which I love. And I like the fact that it's aptly named about food, but also I think it really comes across about your appetite for life. And I just wondered, when you were a child, did you feel that kind of hunger for life? Did your mother have a really difficult time bringing you up because you were just running around, sort of trying everything, leaping on everything?
I think that the real appetite for life probably began about 10, 11 years ago when my midlife crisis started, and I sort of had to go for the broad breadth. But even back then, yeah, I was one of those kids who was running and playing football and those kind of things. When I was very young, we were on holiday in Sheringham, and I was up at the top of a hill just outside Sheringham, which is actually the tallest place in Norfolk, but it's very, very not tall. And I was running, and my dad was there with my little brother, who was like 6 months, and I fell, cut my knee quite badly, had to be rushed down the hill, driven to Cromer Hospital. I went in for 5 stitches. When I came out, my dad had collapsed. He turned out he didn't like the sight of blood, so I had to visit him in A&E while I kind of adjusted to this. And then I was back in the hospital 2 weeks later because I just couldn't bear not to play football. So I was told I wasn't allowed to because of the stitches. Just ignored it, knocked them all out, had to be kind of re-sewn again. So probably that
a sort of bravery in that. Yeah, you've shown, I think, a lot of. You've done so many things in your life, and I think that comes across in the book. It's not so much the political career you had, but the holidays you took with a vet. You've packed an awful lot in, and there's certainly no feeling in the book that you have any thought of slowing down, or even talking to me about what you're doing tonight. He's packing in a musical and then a dinner, and I'm just going home. So I think that you do have a serious energy about you. Now, I'm not criticising this at all, but the one thing it doesn't give in that long list is the title of husband.
No.
And I only mention this because I think the book is a lot about family. There are huge themes of parenthood in there, which are incredibly moving. But also a vet, you and a vet are at the heart of this as a couple. And I think your admiration for her comes out in every page. And there's so many gems in this book, but I wanted you to maybe look back to the time when you both had 3 very young children, because as a parent, working parent myself, I remember those years when they're very young and you're having to deal with work and school and everything. You were both in the cabinet, and you had 3 children under the age of 8. You had 2 homes. You had these cabinet meetings at 9 a.m. And it just, I sort of don't understand how you both got through it.
I think looking back, I'm not quite sure if we understand, but it was mainly, I think, my mum was around quite a bit. My mother-in-law, June, was incredibly important, and we kind of survived. And we all travelled from London to Yorkshire every weekend, both ways on the train. Our oldest daughter's first word was Grantham, because she basically learned to read by looking at the train signs as we went past. And I look back now and feel a bit guilty that we weren't there as much as we should have been, and we were often out very late. We had to have a very extensive, complicated childcare. Did we do it as well as we could have done? But I guess that's
working parenthood.
Always how it's going to
And what was the big meal? You talk about the Saturday night being the one time when you're up in your Grantham constituency.
Yeah.
That there was the one time. But you used to cook dinner that every Saturday night. I don't even know how you had the energy, but I assume that was sort of relaxing for you.
Completely escapism. So in my childhood, the biggest meal by far was Sunday lunch, and that was the one you had to be there for. And we've sort of carried on that in our family, but In those years, you'd have Sunday lunch and then go and get the train at 3 o'clock. And so that wasn't as relaxing.
And you had to read all your papers, the pair of you. You had your red boxes delivered.
You have the post office would come and collect the boxes every Sunday lunchtime at midday. And then, you know, when my seat became marginal, I was also out every Sunday morning knocking on doors for a couple of hours. But Saturday night was the one day where you could devote it to the kids and where you knew that you were going to
get everyone's attention.
And also that you'd actually be in the same place overnight, which was great.
Although you do admit to falling asleep after dinner in front of the telly.
Oh yeah, I always fell asleep. I think probably, I mean, I have watched, as I said in the book, Saturday night was film night. I would go out and buy stuff to cook. In the end, quite often it was kind of steak, because that's actually what I could get all the kids to eat.
And chips.
And chips, or the kind of like garlic rosemary potatoes. But then we'd watch a film. Yeah. I've seen the first half hour of pretty much every kids' film going.
That's it.
But I never got to the end. I mean, the Lord of the Rings. I mean, I've seen the first hour of each of the trilogy tons of times, but I've almost never ever got to the end. I mean, I never know whether the Incredibles succeed. I never know in the end whether in The Sound of Music, do they actually escape?
I love the bit where you talk about going on the train, and if you were on your own, all these men would jump up to help you. But if Yvette was on her own, no one would help her. And I've got to think, God, what's behind that? You would think they'd be completely the opposite way, and you're obviously rather bamboozled by that too. We
were, but it was a really common pattern. So we would get the train up on a Friday evening. And sometimes it would be a vet taking young children, sometimes it would be myself. And normally on a Friday train from King's Cross going up to Leeds, there'd be loads of kind of generally men, not entirely, but generally men in suits going home, and kind of adjusting to getting back into the weekend vibe. But if a vet was getting on the train with a pushchair and one or two kids and all the equipment, they would all smile, but they would never offer to help.
Because they thought she was capable, maybe.
Well, and I think they just didn't want to cause offence. Whereas if it was me, and I would just kind of do this, there would be some guy who would go,
"Can I help you?"
So I'd hand over the children, and they would kind of hold them while I kind of did stuff. It was totally different on a Monday morning. On a Monday morning, nobody, because at that point, these people were all going back to work, putting the families behind them for a few days, and therefore, our daughter had this kind of very loud talking telephone, like a mobile telephone.
Bet that went
on
down.
a Monday morning, it would drive everybody up the wall, whereas on a Friday evening, it was actually quite endearing. They quite liked it.
That's because they'd had a few drinks.
That is also true.
Now, this weekend, as lots of people I'm sure know, is the Labour Party conference, which begins tomorrow down in Brighton. Do you miss politics?
I don't miss going to the Labour Party conference.
Don't you?
I mean, I did.
I'm going for the first time. What should I expect?
It's pretty intense, and
is it? Well,
I did 22 years running.
Yeah.
And when I was young, you knew if they were setting up the set for breakfast TV in the hotel lobby, you really, really should go to bed because you were burning the candle at both ends too far.
Yes, because you told me on the phone the other day that you'd be taking meetings right up till midnight, and then you were expected to go to the bar till 3 or 4 in the morning, because that was where also more talking and more socialising and more manoeuvring happened.
Catastrophic things would happen quite late at night. I mean, if you remember, the Labour conference before Labour got into government in 1997 was the autumn of 1996, and that was the autumn where England had got to the semi-finals of the European Championships held here in Britain, and the big football song of that summer was "Football's Coming Home." So Gordon Brown had decided his conference speech, which was on the Monday, was going to end with this big peroration, "Labour's coming home." And the nature of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown is that they didn't always cooperate fully on all aspects of the jobs. No. And that in particular included sharing speeches. Right. And there was normally, Gordon would finally relent and let Tony Blair see his speech on the Sunday night at about 11 at night.
Really?
And he hands over his speech. Yeah. And then this kind of trauma starts, because Tony Blair's speech, which was the day after, ends on "Labour's coming home." And Gordon says, "But it was my idea." And Tony says, "Well, it was my idea." And Gordon says, my speech is first. Tony says, but I'm the leader. Gordon says, well, I kind of accept that, but I'm not sure if I'm fully reconciled to that fact. But in the end, Gordon had to relent. So we actually then were writing the new end to the speech until about 3 a.m. It was a complete disaster.
What was the new? Can you remember what the new end of the speech was?
No, I mean, it's one of those forgotten mysteries.
You sat. I mean, you were part of Gordon's team for so many years, and you sat between those two in a way. Was it as bad as the press painted it? I mean,
no, and I think actually so.
There must have been moments they got on. No.
I think it was actually better than that. They were very close, and there was an expectation about who was going to be the leader first.
Yeah.
And that all then was overturned in, 92, 93, 94 by the death of John Smith and the rise of Tony Blair, and it was kind of quite a big blow to Gordon. There's no doubt about that, and I don't think that they ever
really
fully
resolved
kind of dealt with
but
that.
You were there at that, talking about food. You were there, and it's in your book. You were there at the famous meal in Islington.
At Granitas.
At Granitas.
I mean, the thing, so the two of them having dinner together was quite an intimate thing.
But you were taken along.
Yes, okay. So Gordon wasn't fully sure he was signed up to the intimacy, is probably the truth. Tony said he wants to have the meeting to decide the future in Granitas on Upper Street.
Okay, and it was just going to be him and Tony, but then
just the two of them.
But you were then
Gordon
taken
says to me,
along.
I've never been to a restaurant like this before. I don't know where it is. I don't think he'd ever really that much been to Islington. Would I go? So I went with him, and we and the three of us were at the table, and the restaurant was quite Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Gordon turns to me and says, "What exactly is polenta?" Which is something that I don't think he had ever seen before, and you know how much he was kind of unhappy about the kind of setting.
Yeah.
That I then went to, after they'd ordered, it was too much for me, and I left, went back down to Westminster. Gordon arrived an hour and a half later and had steak and chips in a restaurant called the Atrium.
You're skipping the bit when you were there, though. What happened in the starters? How can you remember what you ate? How was the atmosphere between him and Tony?
It was. Tony ordered octopus. Gordon had
probably to throw
undoubtedly soup. I'm sure that was the case. I mean, when you think about it now, I mean, it's so odd that they would think they could get away with, probably the next Prime Minister and Chancellor meeting in a restaurant to decide, the deal.
So there was an Evening Standard diarist, unfortunately for them, 2 tables up, who listened to the whole thing and reported it to our newspaper.
Listen to the whole thing, because if so, she'd have reported it better. But it was Alison Phillips who then broke this story of the Granitas dinner. People think, as I said in the book, people think about it as being where they made a deal over the leadership. And, people said afterwards, did Tony promise to stand down and support Gordon later?
Yeah.
I actually don't think that was what was going on at all.
No.
Because, I don't think Tony would ever have said that. And if Gordon was in his right mind, he would never have really believed it. And there was, of course, there was that kind of mood music. The fundamental thing was the deal was about partnership.
Yeah.
That Gordon said, I want to be in charge of economic and social policy, and I want this to be a partnership and to be consulted, including on appointments.
So do you think Gordon went into that knowing that Tony Blair was the one to lead the party at that point?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, it was all about. It was one of those classic moments where it was a meal to formalise an inevitability.
Right.
The food was irrelevant, as is often the case in politics. It wasn't about the food. It was about this this moment. The thing is, though, even 15 years later, when Tony's finally standing down in a quite difficult circumstances, I was in Gordon's flat. Tony rings Gordon on his mobile to get his personal advice about how to frame his leaving departure statement. I mean, the two of them were always closer personally and supportive, but constitutionally it was quite challenging. Yeah. I mean, Tony didn't want to consult Gordon on appointments, fair enough. Gordon didn't want Britain to join the single currency, the euro. It turned out to be the right call.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting thing. I've talked to George Osborne about this when we've been on public discussions, because George talks about the unease he had about David Cameron calling the EU referendum,
Yeah.
his worries about that. But George, I think, at that point decided to defer, and Gordon didn't defer.
Yeah.
I think Gordon saw, challenges his duty. Maybe it was his personality.
Yeah.
But, in that kind of level of politics, whatever the personal relations are,
Yeah.
there's also your job and
Yeah.
your role
Yeah.
and your duty.
And how you
and
see
sometimes that leads to friction.
Yeah.
And if you can't handle the friction, actually Blair and Brown handled, the tension.
I think the problem was
a long
that
time.
tension became too public, because I suspect with George and David there was actually quite a lot of tension behind the scenes, but they kept it private. But
That's true.
it came out quite publicly with Tony
true.
Blair and Gordon, and that must have frustrated some of you both in each of the teams, didn't you? Because
I
it
think
probably distracted sometimes from what
Yeah. Oh no, I think
very big policies you were trying to put through in those years.
it was hugely distracting, and also they had arguments over what ended up being big issues of substance,
Yeah.
and that was kind of really, really hard, and there was from early on a succession discussion,
Yeah.
and I don't think there was ever, whatever Tony
An
thought,
odd
there,
conversation to have early on, isn't it?
but there was never the people around Tony were never reconciled to Gordon taking over. And so what happens in politics is that if you're not careful, the succession fight starts quite early on.
Yeah.
But, but I got my first ever job from Tony Blair in a reshuffle in 2006. And I'd been waiting for 24 or 48 hours. He rang me. I get a call, the Downing Street switchboard is on the phone, there's a very long delay, and he comes on the phone finally and says, "Ed, it's Tony." And I said, "Prime Minister." And he said, "I've been thinking very hard about how to use your particular skills and talents." And he said, "I'd like you to be a junior business minister in Northern Ireland." And I remember thinking, well, this is a total disaster. How do we handle this? What will the vets say? How do we this? But I said, Prime Minister, of course I'll be happy to serve in that role.
And
I
in
said,
the back of your head
Tony,
going, how am I going to break this to the wife?
well, I actually said, Tony, it's actually, if I'm honest with you, the job I've always wanted, because that is what you say. And there was a pause on the line, and then he went, gotcha. Only joking, it's the Treasury, and hung up. And that was how I got my first job. So there was always a lightness and a personalness to it, which isn't always seen in the way which things are seen publicly.
And you talk a lot about food in politics and how no one really took any notice of the food. How was eating and drinking used to calm down situations? Because you talk about how people went off to plot with meals, and in fact even you and Yvette were accused of, you hold a lasagna night, that it came out as a massive plot, both of which you've denied endlessly. But how would it work in, you talk about when you go into the Westminster restaurant, you tried to go over to a table and were immediately pulled back and said, no, that's the Tories. You can only sit with your tribe. But there was some mixing between the tribes behind the scenes. I mean, that's how a lot of good government work happens. Did you do it in the bar and over meals?
It was never in the dining rooms. So there was a role for food, which is about your group coming together.
Yeah.
And all the fundraisers people have, and the dinners, and people travel around speaking at these big fundraising dinners. That will all be within your group.
Yeah.
And the same was true in the House of Commons. I mean, it would be totally unacceptable in the big dining room for people to mix. There was Labour tables, and there was Conservative tables, and there was one in the middle for the Speaker and one in the middle for the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
And that was it. And as you said, I moved towards a table and was pulled back. That's not where we sit. And so although that kind of mixing does happen, it wouldn't really ever happen formally in the House of Commons in that way.
Outside.
The other thing, which is you're right, is that if you remember back in pre-1997, this suggestion that Michael Portillo was plotting against John Major.
Yeah.
There were stories about installing telephone lines and having meetings. And I think what happens in politics is if you have a meeting, people think it's a plot.
Yeah.
Whereas if you do it over a meal, then that feels like more normal.
Yeah.
So, the point where Tom Watson and a group went for Tony Blair, that was all done over a curry house in the West Midlands, because doing it over food sounds benign. Of course, one of the consequences of that became that over time, during my time in politics, anytime you ever saw politicians eating together,
Thought
you
they were
thought
plotting.
they must
And
be
they
plotting.
weren't. They were just having a meal.
And that was the lasagna gate. Yvette and I had invited our teams round to our house, and their partners, about
And
35
what year
people.
was this?
This was about 2012, probably, or 2013. And it was 35 people. I mean, the main memory I had of it was that we had vegetarians, vegans, and celiacs, and I had to do 5 different lasagnas. So my memory is of just being a culinary challenge, to be honest. However, the following Sunday, it was double page in the Mail on Sunday, Ed and Yvette's lasagna plot. And the assumption was, if we had 35 politicians to our house, it must have been a plot against Ed Miliband.
But you were,
And then
you
when
were in
we didn't plot
opposition
against-
then, and you were just trying to make people feel better, weren't you?
but
It was tough at the time.
We were,
and-
but Ed was under pressure in the polls. And of course, when we then don't strike against Ed Miliband, that isn't evidence we weren't plotting. It's
No,
just
that you were
evidence
foiled
that we
by
were
the press.
incompetent.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what happened.
And instead, actually, you were just cooking endless lasagnas,
Exactly.
trying to be nice.
Exactly.
Did you? So, what a lot of people probably don't know is that you and George Osborne actually get on really rather well, despite your quite fractious fights at in PMQs and in the House of Commons. Was that again? How do you form those when you're having quite sort of strong words publicly? Would you use a glass of wine or food to get over that privately and get on with each other? I mean, because it's not true that all the parties don't get on with each other. There's lots of relationships across parties in Westminster.
Well, if you think about like 2019 and the discussions about Brexit, that was an extreme time when people were working together across parties, depending upon their view, leave or remain.
Yeah.
But more generally, there are times when there is kind of common agendas and common interests, and so therefore people don't always do things down partisan lines. In the case of George and I think we were always, in terms of policy and politics, on opposing sides. And at the point I came into Parliament, he had just become the Shadow Chancellor.
Yeah.
And I ended up being Shadow Chancellor when he was the Chancellor.
Yeah.
And at times it was quite angry and quite bitter. We had a huge row about something that he said about me in The Spectator, which went on for a very long time. So at times it was kind of quite hard. However, we were also kind of young politicians on the way up.
Yeah.
And we got invited to these international sort of gatherings which happen in Berlin or in Paris or in Madrid. And we would often be stuck in the bar at 11 at night and would just talk about life and how it was going.
Yeah.
And we were both people who had
And you both had a love of
kids,
economics and you had families. And
all those kind of things. There was a time when I was on, well, there were lots of times George and I were on Mar together, normally the Sunday before the budget. And there was one particular Sunday where after the Mar interview, which I think would have been probably a little bit fractious and sort of, but with humour, hopefully, afterwards, I had to go and do a quick interview on 5 Live before we were all, what happened on the Mar programme is people go and have breakfast together for like half an hour afterwards. And both of us, by chance, I'd taken my son to come along so he could look at it and see what it was like. And George has brought, I think, his older daughter. And so as we were leaving, George said, if you like, your son can come up to breakfast with me and while you do your 5 Live interview. This then became, I don't know how it got out, this became a story that George Osborne was babysitting my son, which of course is not quite what was going on. And I had to ring him and talk about how we would handle that. So
but
there
it's
were lots
quite
of
nice
different occasions like that. And of course we've done the election for the last 2 times. I mean, I think George Osborne is the only person I've spent the whole night with other than Yvette since 2015.
Oh yes, the last
Twice.
election. Yes, you were up till
7 in the morning.
7 in the morning. I don't know how you two stayed awake that night.
I think the truth is that there's an element of liberation to it because we both experienced what it is like to be on election night, and I probably, for me, slightly more brutally than George, but he's experienced defeat or loss as well.
Brexit, that was pretty brutal.
Brexit, and then in the end, what happened afterwards, and we both are able to, from a different perspective, reflect on what's happening in politics and sort of, agree or disagree. I mean, in 2017, there was a point early on in the election night programme where George was being so brutal about Theresa May. I kind of jump in and say to Tom Bradbury, I think it's slightly unfair putting George in this position, and he didn't seem to care. So that was the Thursday before, if you remember, he said, Dead Woman Walking, which became a bit of
that was
bit of
leaked
a
out.
thing.
Yeah.
So I think.
But do you think it's nice? I got a sense from your book, and I think I would hope coming out of the pandemic that one would hope that politics. I think Brexit was a very divisive time for a lot of people, but I think, and you've just seen. Going back to the Labour Party right now, you've got Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer. And I think it can be seen that politics can be... I think politicians are often painted as so hungry and ambitious, they'll sort of tread over anyone to get there. And I think the story between the two brothers, the two Miliband's, was a sad public face of that, though I'm sure it was much more complex underneath. Do you think we've got to a point now where politicians are increasingly demonised, and do we want to go down that route?
Well,
how do politicians sort of show their human side, I suppose, and remind people that as much as they might be painted as messing up, or I mean, I think politicians, especially with Twitter and social media, can become a sort of focus point for people's anger and frustration.
I think it cuts both ways. Politicians are people with families who make mistakes and don't always know the answer, and can sometimes need time to reflect, but they can also explain things are difficult.
Yeah.
But there isn't always a premium on doing that. I think every time politicians don't answer the question, don't say it's hard, don't explain the dilemma, they make things harder.
Yeah.
But every time a journalist says, John Humphrys was the worst, well, we can't expect a straight answer from a politician. Or politicians, they're all the same. The moment you do that, you diminish the standing of politics. And in a democracy, you need young people to feel inspired to go
into
and
politics.
play this role, because if not, in the end, you get the politicians you deserve. And if you don't value what politics is, you end up with the wrong people becoming the politicians. I had it a lot when I did Strictly, that people would say, and still do now, they'll say, we always knew you were a politician, but it was really good to see that you became a human being.
Yeah, and you were like, but I was a human being.
I kind of always was a human being,
Yeah.
but there's something about the prism of politics, which means people don't see through to the human, but it's also the case that politicians, I don't think, always do enough to try and break that prism. That's, I think, why the Angela Rayner thing. I mean, I actually feel kind of...
Angela gave, I don't know if anyone has read it, Angela gave a very honest interview to a newspaper today about her upbringing and why that affects who she is and how she comes across. And I actually read it and thought differently about her, because I think all I've seen to date publicly, I suppose partly the media's painted that, but this rather fractious relationship between her and Keir Starmer, where it may not be fractious at all. It's a sort of delicate balance, isn't it, for politicians to open up their private lives and their families to the media eye, because it can swing back on you. You've chosen to keep your children extremely private.
Very private.
We don't know their names. We've never seen a picture of them. But at the same time, you also came to the decision to reveal something quite private about yourself.
Well, I think first of all, on Angela, I feel equivocal about the Angela interview today. I think I have two different emotions about it, and I think she's really good, and she's got a great story, and she's a good performer, and she's passionate, and I think she's a good deputy leader for Labour. But on the one hand, she actually talks in a very open way about kind of vulnerability and her unease, her sense of being, was she worth it?
Yeah.
Could people like her succeed?
Yeah.
And it is the biggest challenge for to persuade people that you can do it too.
Yeah.
On the other hand, politics has become so partisan and so divided that, I mean, we talk, or people talk as if the other side, it's not just that I disagree with them or that they're incompetent, but they're evil, that, I hate them, that actually, I think the polarisation which you saw in the Remain-Leave debate has actually become more broad-based in the way in which we do our politics. You see the same thing over in America as well, and I think that's quite dangerous.
Yes.
Because in the end, one of the things I take from my time in politics is that in the end, the only things you ever change are the things which become consensual.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's not a bad thing for politicians in the end to
keep talking
agree.
to each other.
When George Osborne said, I want to raise the minimum wage, I could have said, the Tories voted against the minimum wage, it's a con, you're evil.
Yeah.
Or I can say, it's good the Tories want to raise the minimum wage because actually that
That's something
shows
we
Labour
believe in
succeeded
too. Yeah, because we
in
persuaded
our
them
campaign
of
for the
it.
minimum wage.
Yeah.
And that's not an unfashionable approach.
Yeah.
It's not a fashionable approach at the moment, but I feel at the moment our society expects both sides to knock lumps out of each other to such an extent that you get away from any sense of
But I suppose
commonality.
it could be seen that right ahead of the Labour conference and also her media round this morning, that she is also positioning herself for the leadership challenge. But she may have just been saying, this is who I am and I want to stick up for women and you can come from anywhere. So
I think she was doing both and that's fine.
Yeah, right.
Well, of course she was doing both, and that is fine. I mean, I'm not saying she's positioning for a leadership challenge, but she's undoubtedly positioning herself as somebody who has a set of views and a set of values, and wants to be defined in that way. And I think it's good and it's popular.
Yeah.
And I may not like every aspect of it, but I probably don't like every aspect of any politician's stance. But it's exactly what she should do.
What do you think Keir has got to show us in the next few days?
I think, I think in the end, in politics, people have to decide they want to listen to you before they hear what you say. And you can say lots of things and have lots of policies, lots of positions, but you have to, and it's more the case now than 30, 50 years ago, you have to make people feel that you understand them, and when you react to situations, that people nod and say,
you get it.
Yeah, the pandemic has been a very challenging time.
Do you think Labour have got to that point yet?
I don't think Labour's got to that point yet, and I think that is, and
I still feel they're talking to each other.
I think that is true, and I think, and that is partly because of the contested nature of the last leadership election. It's partly to do with the fight which is happening within Labour about the future. It's partly that you have a membership and a set of MPs now, which is which is less reflective of the whole of the UK. Far fewer Scots, fewer Welsh MPs, fewer Northern MPs, fewer MPs who represent outside big urban areas. And so, Keir's big political challenge is to reach out more widely than the conversation in Brighton. And that's a hard thing to do.
How important is his speech? What do you want him? What advice would you give him for his speech on Wednesday?
Well, I accept that he decided to write a 14,000-word pamphlet. Yeah. But I'm not sure if I would necessarily use that as my text.
No.
And I think he needs a moment where he kind of rips up the script and talks beyond the hall. Yeah. And actually, if it feels as though that he's
but this is his first big speech because he came.
If he's talking
leader
to the hall
in a pandemic,
he's talking to the party. That isn't. I mean,
he's going to talk to the country, isn't he? But he's going to have to really sort of blow us out the water a bit.
There's been lots of conversation about kind of Labour needing their sort of Neil Kinnock 1985 Bournemouth moment. I remember that moment very well. In a way, that was a hugely important moment for Neil Kinnock and his leadership, and it allowed him by 87 to start really to talk to the country. Yeah. But I mean, the 85 speech was a very, very internal, in the hall moment, and maybe the challenge for Keir is that is still where
he's got
Labour politics
on.
is. But but if that's he needs to get he needs to reach out
to
beyond.
All of us. Yeah.
He needs to, in my view, he needs to talk about Britain and Britain's future. Yeah. And the sense that Labour is still refighting 2016 is
and
is
old
bad
battles
for
in
Keir.
a way. You have had to make many speeches yourself, and you have a stammer, and you hid that for many years. How did you come about to discuss it? I mean, what?
Oh gosh!
Because you talk about it in the book, and it's very moving actually. But it was obviously quite a big decision.
I didn't even know that I had a stammer. I just knew that things went wrong sometimes in communication, and I think I always thought a stammer was where you stammered.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't get the words out.
That's what my father does.
But I got selected as a candidate, having been in the Treasury for 8 years, and did any questions, and it was the weekend Tony Blair had announced he was going to fight a third term, and I think I did quite a good answer about Blair and Brown, and I get asked about some other question, and I couldn't get the words to come. They just didn't come out. And this was the days before social media and Twitter or any of those things. And so you sort of come out and you don't really quite know how it's gone because nobody really tells you.
Yeah.
There was no sort of public reaction. And the next morning, my dad rang me and said, I don't know what it is, but you've got the same as me. And I think it might stop you ever being able to succeed in politics, which was incredibly unhelpful because, I mean, you know, if you didn't know what it was, why was he telling me this? And then finally, I had a kind of very bad, this happened lots of times in the next 3 or 4 years where the words just wouldn't come. And it always happened in live TV and live radio. I remember John Sopel.
Didn't that make you terrified of going and doing these
Yeah, but you had to do it because, I mean, I was a minister and I was, you know, this is what I had to do. And normally it was okay. And then sometimes it would go wrong. I remember one time, John Sopel looking at me like, you know, we're on live TV, say something.
What's wrong with
you?
Now,
I mean, I think in my mind, these were long things. Actually, they're pretty quite tight and quite short. However, I was in the cabinet, my first education questions, and just the first bit where I had to use a script, it was quite blocky. And as I sat down, Gwyneth Dunwoody said very loudly, he's supposed to be the Secretary of State and he can't get his words out. And it kind of echoed around the chamber. And it started a whole thing where, you know, the Conservatives barracked me a lot because they knew that this would sometimes happen. And I went back, so it had been happening for the last year when I was a Treasury Minister. I went back to the department and said, you've got to tell me, what is this, what is this? And they came back and said, it's an interiorised stammer. And
so it's a stammer that you can't hear, but
on the inside.
It's on the inside.
A block. Actually, most people who have stammer have blocks. Huge numbers of people get through the whole life without even telling their partner, let alone their work colleagues. But sometimes it just goes wrong. And
then tell me about the school, because that was the moment where the children and the father turned around to you and said, "What if you can't admit it to these kids?"
First of all, I get a therapist. I said, I can't have a therapist. I'm a cabinet minister. They say, you have to have a therapist. And I go see the therapist, and she says, it's a stammer. I say, I don't really believe it's a stammer. And she said, I promise you, she said, this will not get better unless you go public. I said, I can't go public because I'm a cabinet minister. Cabinet ministers don't admit these kind of things. You can't. And she said, fine, we'll work on it. And I used to basically, she'd give me an exercise. I'd practice with Nick Robinson on the evening news or the next day in Parliament, and then we'd watch it back a week later and discuss whether or not I was improving. But she always said, and then I did lots of different things around stammering to kind of try and kind of get into the frame of it. And I had told Nick Robinson, I told the Speaker, and then me and Michael Palin, I told Michael Palin, because Michael Palin's father had a bad stammer.
Yeah.
Michael Palin played a stammerer in A Fish Called Wanda.
Yeah. And
then afterwards felt incredibly guilty about it. And therefore, he's been the chair of the Michael Palin Centre for Stammering Children for 40 years in London.
Which was why you were at this school together.
And we were at this school together, and we have a video called Wait, Wait, I've Not Finished Yet, which was a video of children telling teachers not to interrupt, not to finish their sentences, to give them space to speak. It was a brilliant video.
Yeah.
I found it very emotional to watch. I had to then make a speech. I was probably quite stammery. Afterwards came off. A journalist said to me, you know, there was a huddle of journalists, and a journalist said to me, "You're a coward." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because you've got a stammer and you won't speak about it." I said, "Well, you know, this is not about me. I don't know what you mean." He said, "My son is in the video. He's 8, and he's speaking about his stammer, and you won't. You're a coward." And I went back to the department. It was terrible. And I realised he was right. And I wrote a letter to all of these kids to say, I've got a stammer too. And the following weekend, I did my first ever interview about it with Mary Riddell and The Telegraph. And my dad rang me and said, "I've just read The Telegraph, And
I
I've
realise
just
now
found
what
out
I've got.
I've got a stammer. He was 70. He'd been an academic lecturer for 40 years. He never knew that's what it was. And it was a huge turning point. And, you know, I stammer all the time, but I
But
don't
you
mind
find,
talking about it. I deal with it.
but was she right, the therapist?
Completely
It
right.
took a lot away of the fear.
It still goes wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
It still goes wrong.
But you're
that's
more
okay.
matter of fact about
The
it.
the thing you have to learn, which in a way goes back to Angela Rayner's interview and why, and whether politics allows you to do this. In the end, the thing you have to say is just who I am.
Yeah.
And you have to own it and just accept it.
Yeah.
And once you do that, and you actually kind of become so proud of it. I mean,
Yeah.
if it hadn't been for the stammer, I'd have never done the TV stuff I do. I mean, it would be far too scary. But after but the stammer was so hard. Compared to that, dancing live in front of 10 million people on a Saturday night was never as difficult as it would have been before the stammer. I was talking to Colin Firth. Colin Firth and I have done quite a lot of stuff around stammering together because, of course, he played the King in the King's Speech.
Yeah.
And and I met him in the House of Commons to talk about this and to persuade him to become a patron of the Children's Stammering Charity. And I said to him, the best moment in the King's Speech is the final moment where the King, he arrives, all formal, does the photographs like we were doing earlier. Then the photographers are thrown out. He loosens his jacket. He gets all relaxed, delivers his speech pretty well, comes off. His therapist, Logue, says, that was not bad, but you did stammer in the third paragraph on the B. And the King said, look, I had to throw one in. So they knew it was really me. So he actually owned
it.
The stammer. You know, the authentic him does this, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And so I said to Colin Firth, that is the best moment in the film. And Colin Firth said they found the diaries of the therapist very late in making the film. Colin Firth personally took them home for the weekend, went back in on the Monday and said to the director, I found this line.
We've got to put it in.
It's got to go in.
God, how brilliant.
So the reason why Colin Firth won the Oscar is because he understood that fundamental insight, which is the ownership, the authentic ownership is the thing.
Amazing.
And that's what Angela does. She owns her story and who she is. And I think any time in public life, when you deny
who you are,
the truth about who you are, it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And actually, the moment where you reveal can sometimes be quite destabilizing and quite scary, but actually, once you've done it, it's so much better.
If you've got a story that you think will be palatable, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, but I didn't because I thought it was totally unpalatable.
Yeah, but it was palatable, actually.
I thought it was a disaster.
Yeah. Talking about Strictly, what?
We're missing it at the moment. Can you believe it?
I know, it's starting tonight. When they sent that invite for you to do it, were you like, no way, what are you thinking? Did Yvette go, no way, I don't want you on stage in some spangly pants? I mean, or did you just go, yeah, great? What was the sort of thought, what was the thought process? Because, I mean, that's a terrifying thing to do.
Oh, I mean, I think if I'd known quite how terrifying it was going to be, I might have said no. But you know, I mean, I can say that now as a retired former professional dancer, but at the time, when I was an amateur, it was a bit more destabilising. No, but actually what happened was, the offer came through. I was just going to say no. I mean, obviously.
So who persuaded you to say yes?
Yvette.
Did she?
Yeah, Yvette said, of course you should do it. This was a year after I'd lost my seat. She said, of course you should do it. She said, politics is wild. I mean, who knows what's going on?
Yeah.
Why would you turn down the chance to go on the biggest television show in the world? Go and enjoy it. And I looked at her like, what? And I then actually, I rang...
Could you dance at that point at all?
Of course not. I mean, no.
Had you even swung Yvette round a dance floor at
we actually did a 3-hour dance class on a cruise in 2007.
Yes, I remember that in your book.
But other than that, no. And but we could do a little bit of jiving at weddings. We had like a little bit of a routine you could do when needed. I mean, every couple needs something. And
so do you fling around the dance floor now very professionally?
Not as fast as we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I then rang Jeremy Vine, who I didn't know that well, but he had done the previous year.
Yeah.
He said it was the most life-affirming thing I've done in my life.
Really?
He said it was the most life-affirming thing. And you'll love it.
And was it the most life-affirming thing?
Oh, it's fabulous. I mean, you know.
Can you still pull those shapes?
Bruce Springsteen is probably complacent about playing the O2. But I mean, I've played the O2, 4 times, where it's just me and Katya in front of 15,000 people, and they all They all loved it. And actually, it was a huge kind of revelation that you actually could enjoy something, and actually, more importantly, people could enjoy it with you.
Yeah.
At the end of each show so the TV show was amazing and very intense.
But you all go on tour afterwards.
Really hard work. But the tour is the bit where...
How long do you tour afterwards
About
for?
30 dates, 3 months.
Wow.
But about a month and a half, 30 dates.
But you're
every
dancing
arena,
nearly every night in front of
twice a
thousands
day.
of people.
So you'd come out at 10:30 at night, sign some autographs, get on the tour bus, drive through the night. I'd go from Sheffield. I remember so well. We got on the tour bus at Sheffield to drive to Glasgow, and we drove through Morley. And I looked out of the window as we drove through my old constituency, thinking,
what the hell's happened here?
On the tour, I lost my seat in the Leeds Arena in a kind of very brutal way at 7:30 in the morning. The next time I went back to the Leeds Arena was with a 27-year-old Russian world professional dance champion to do Gangnam Style in front of 8,000 people from Leeds. And on that night, they all had to vote on their mobile phones. We won the Glitter Ball. I mean, the bastards voted for me that time, which they hadn't done.
They didn't vote the time before.
A year and a half before.
Well, you wouldn't have been on Strictly if they'd voted for you.
What I found was, this is kind of, this may not be interesting for you, but this is the thing I remember so well. You have this whole kind of deal. The whole show, and we knew what we were doing, and the audience were going to love it. And you'd get to the end, the final bows, where Justin Timberlake. I mean, I don't think I knew who he was at the time, but but then I did, and there was playing the kind of final 2-minute play-out music, and the professionals would all rush to the front and sign autographs from the front row. And I realised if you started in one corner and just went round doing this with your arms, there was 15,000 people in the O2 who all joined in. And it was
much more fun than politics.
I've spoken in lots and lots of big arenas, but it was always a bit more on the edge which way it was going to go.
Yeah.
And suddenly people, to do something which is like joyous and where everybody wants to join in. Every night they thought that lift might not work. Very exciting.
He's been threatening to do the lift with me on the stage. I've said no. It's definitely not happening.
Well, no. I do know how to do it. So if you
thanks.
Katja actually banned me when we were doing the live show. I was banned from doing lifts with anybody else other than her because she said,
You'll hurt someone.
She was worried I was going to hurt my back. She basically said, other than me, you're not allowed to.
Thanks. Are you saying I'd hurt your back?
No. I think the truth is being lifted is actually very hard.
It is.
It's much harder. The great thing about being lifted...
As if I'd know.
If you're the lifter, you stand still.
Mm-hmm.
As long as your timing's right.
Yeah.
Your feet are on the ground.
But if you're lifting
Whereas
someone...
the person being lifted is actually a very, very difficult skill because it's very much about kind of really strong core. And the moment you slightly position wrong and the weight slips, then it can do a lot of damage to both of us. And
Did
so
you practice
that
it on
thing we
Yvette?
did called the round the world.
Yeah.
Nowhere. I mean,
Would she let you? So you've never done a lift with Yvette?
No.
Not even one?
No.
Daughters?
No.
No. Like,
no, but I have got one we could do.
No.
I'm just saying. We could.
No, we couldn't. There's a very, very moving chapter in the book where you talk about your mother and her dementia.
Yep.
And I thought we've actually not ended up talking about food that much. And the book
the
book is filled with most wonderful. Well, I know it's sort of weird to talk about food when there is no food around us. I looking back, I realised I should have got Ed to cook in front of everybody while questioning him, just to really, make life hard for you. But there's this wonderful. The book talks a lot about your family meals, Yvette and your children, but also with your parents, her parents, and all your family gathering together with your mother and father in Norwich. And I just wondered if you wanted to describe yourself rather than me, the moment when you realise, heartbreakingly, that your mother's dementia is quite serious because of what happens at this family meal that she's preparing.
So I was taught to cook by my mum. My mum was kind of a, innovative 70s cook in that she and my dad had been out in America in the 60s and she did do sort of slightly unusual American type dishes, but it was still very, very traditional. It was only meat. She was a butcher's daughter. My grandfather was a butcher in Norwich. and the kind of a lot of the things which I've cooked through my life, you know, I add chili and coriander and things, but often they start with the base recipes that she taught me. And I think one of the things the book is about, it was interesting, the genesis of the book was the bestseller at the end of the last pandemic in 2021 was Theodore Roosevelt, the American president's book called Letters to My Children, which was this sort of post-pandemic reflection on the importance of family. And I had done Best Home Cook and talked a lot about how important cooking was for our family. Actually, we found with all the rest of our contestants, we all wanted to cook the recipes which we'd learned from our mums or dads, because they were important in our lives. And you realise that so many of your important memories are food related, although not normally because of the food, but because what the food
allows people to gather.
But then my mum's had dementia now for 17 years probably, and she's been in a home for 3 years, but for the previous more than a decade was living at home, and she'd been forgetting, and she I mean, we knew this was happening, although my mum never at any point ever acknowledged.
Yeah, you said she was very good at hiding it.
She could conceal, she could hide, but you know, one of my great regrets is we never ever were able to talk to her about what was happening to her, because she just wouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things you realise is there's so many other conversations you should have had. But anyway, we've gone, and this must be probably 12 years ago, so quite early on, all of us to have dinner with my mum and dad up in North Norfolk coast. And my mum had made a chicken casserole, 15 of us around the table, my brother and sister, all of our families, and it's served up. My sister is taking it out of the pot. And as
she's made this hundreds of times for you,
oh
hasn't
yeah,
she? It's
yeah,
like
a total obvious,
old
very
dish
traditional.
she's been feeding you
And
for many years.
And as we cut into it, I mean, it's completely raw. And it had obviously only been in the oven for
2 minutes,
5 minutes. And it needed an hour and a half, 2 hours. And she just didn't know. And then at that time, we didn't even acknowledge it. My sister said, maybe this needs a little bit longer in the oven. And we all sort of scraped it off our plates, and back in it went for an hour and a half. And my mum just sat there looking kind of confused. Why was this happening? And then a few weeks later, she made lasagna for, again, 15, 2 lasagnas. One of them had no pasta in at all. It was just like a soup.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, when I showed
because she'd been such a good cook, you knew this was
her recipe.
quite a watershed moment.
When I showed my
dementia.
dad the book, he says that he has no memory of any of these stories. He said because it happened so often, it was just so normal. He said there was the one he did remember was when my sister was there, my mum was doing the ironing and poured milk into the iron. And so this started to sort of kind of foam. So they rushed out and bought an electric iron. But it was never possible to acknowledge the reality of what was happening. And then what then happened, my dad started to do the cooking at home. And my mum sort of didn't really like that. But then when we had family gatherings, I started doing the cooking. And it would be this continual struggle because, she had to be man-marked. Because if I was in the kitchen and you put anything if you're doing roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, you put anything in the oven, she'd take it out within 5 minutes. If you asked her to prepare things, she was offended because this was her kitchen. Who were you to tell her what to do? And it was very, very, in that period, for years.
And how?
So actually, the food had been so important, and her using food to bind the family, and then the food was the thing where we realised that her mind, dementia, was taking over. And my dad was desperate to carry on food and the family coming together. And navigating around my mum just became very, very difficult. We're now at the point where, it's beyond that. So she can now come from the home to lunch. In the pandemic, we couldn't do that. It was very hard, but we'll start doing it again. But now she's at the point where she couldn't really participate other than singing.
I love the bit about you singing. So
all you have to do is start singing, and
Ed describes how conversation becomes very challenging, really, and arguments can flare up because there's just misunderstandings. And she began to look quite morose at meals. But then one of you just broke into song one day and worked out that that's what she loved.
I mean, we were worried that noise was going to agitate her. And, you know, we'd been a family who always argued and talked over dinner. And my mum found that quite difficult and bewildering. So your instinct is to think, what we should do is be quieter. And actually you realised that if somebody just started singing Lord of all hopefulness, or Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, or Jerusalem, or kind of like hits from the musicals, anything, ABBA, the moment you started, all the words came back and she'd join in. So actually, I mean, it became just as raucous as it used to be, but this was not with words,
fun,
but
you're
just
all
with
singing. That's lovely.
just with
cooking and singing. I think that's a lovely picture.
I know, and it's a very good friend of mine who was had her mother had dementia, and she said that that if you are with a, I mean, her analogy was a wardrobe. She said, you know, her mother loved clothes, and they would kind of be up in the bedroom, would open the wardrobe, and she'd take out something and say, how about this? And her mum would say, that's awful. I don't want to wear that. Absolutely not. And your instinct is always to say, you know, as a person, no, it's nice. Or, but you chose that. Or, but that's what you wore at. Or, are you sure?
Or challenging
and
them,
the
really.
Anything. And what you learn with dementia is you just have to say, okay.
Yeah.
And you put it back in the wardrobe, and you shut the door.
Live in the moment.
And you stand back, and you give it 30 seconds, and then you open the wardrobe again.
Yeah.
And you say, what do you think about this? And it could be a totally different reaction. And actually, the discipline which it takes to live like that is so hard. And my dad would be so patient. And every now and then he would just kind of say something frustrated.
Yeah.
And my mum would be upset.
Yeah.
But of course, my mum would forget within a minute what happened. And my dad would be thinking about it for days afterwards. And a couple of times I would say to Mum, you know, don't take the Yorkshire puddings out of the oven.
Yeah.
And then you kind of carry that guilt. And I think one of the hardest things is to, on the other hand, I think the thing you learn is
just to live in the moment.
Well, but it's actually not a bad way to live your life.
Yeah.
That actually, you know,
forget something, let it slide by.
And also just, you know, every day to open the wardrobe and see what's in it. You know, and try and smile more.
Yeah.
And so that's partly what I've done.
Is that what you, just our final question, we hope that some of us learned something during COVID and those lockdowns. I thought you had such I mean, the reason I love so many bits of your book is there's this wonderful hopefulness that comes through. And I think, what did you learn during COVID? Because it was a tough time for a lot of people, but I think we all try to think we've learned something out of such a major thing that happened to societies across the world.
Well, I think first of all of our children came home, which was kind of unexpected because we kind of thought that wasn't ever going to quite happen again. Certainly not for months at a time. After about a month of the beginning of the pandemic in March, I kind of got a bit bored. I was cooking every day, so I started experimenting. And after a week, there was a rebellion. My youngest daughter said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing all these new things?
We just want spaghetti bolognese.
Just do what you know we like." And that actually, they wanted the familiar and the ritual. And actually, so it was a good thing to see that the food and the eating was going to be part of their lives as it had been. I've talked more to my dad in the last year and a half than in the previous 20 years combined, easily. Because he was living alone. My mum was in a care home. He had to isolate because he was in his early 80s. He had to learn how to use Zoom. And we did a daily call with him, me, my brother and my sister, and we're now down to 2 or 3 a week. But actually, you know, it's been very important to him. And I don't think that I'd understood how lonely he might have been pre the pandemic.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, and how important it was what we did.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, there are lots of people have had, I think, these experiences. There's lots of very difficult
Reaffirming
things.
family.
And, you know, on the wing of my mum's dementia wing, 2 of the 29 residents died in 2 weeks, and my mum was positive and didn't really have any symptoms, and that was a very destabilising time. So many people have had very difficult experiences. I've been working in care homes for the last 4 months for a BBC documentary next month, and so the staff and the families and the residents have had a very hard time. So I'm not in any way going to. I don't feel rosy about the pandemic at all, but I think there's certain things about the way in which we live together, which actually you sort of want to
carry on,
hold on to. I think one of the things which worries me, I think, is I don't know whether others have had this experience. I was saying to a vet last weekend, I said, I don't really feel as if we've seen many people. I mean, I said recently, have we been unsociable? And she said, there's been a pandemic. And you think, of course there has. And actually, you sort of, it's quite easily to compartmentalize it away. And, you know, I've gone back to a live football match to see Norwich lose. And it's almost, and you almost kind of forget the period in between.
Yeah.
But the thing I think which worries me is that there are lots of people who have got very used to having to be alone in the last 18 months. And that might become a big habit.
Yeah.
And we almost have to sort of, you know, we focus a lot on young people rightly, and they need to make up for the education loss they've had in the last 18 months. And that's been hugely unequally distributed. But I worry that people who are older, there's lots of people who will just have got into a pattern of
being on their
loneliness.
own.
And I think we sort of need to
connect.
consciously try and break that.
Yeah. Or maybe some of them, like you with your dad, actually found they got more attention.
Well, I think that's right with my dad, but I'm not.
Society continues that.
But I don't feel confident that is the norm.
Yeah.
And it could not have been the case with us.
Yeah.
And it worries me that the randomness of that. And
Now it's
and maybe it gives you an appreciation of how many people's lives were pre-pandemic as well. Because it's only when you've experienced it yourself, as we all kind of did, that you have a window into that sort of
closed down
isolation.
Life. Yeah.
And that's a bad thing. And our society is not very good at opening its arms to people who would otherwise be alone.
No.
And maybe we need to be better at that.
I think we do. Now we have to finish up now. Thank you so much, Ed. Now your book is Appetite. It's Sunday lunch tomorrow. What are you going to be cooking?
So my son is on a boat in the English Channel, doing his sailing exam, so he's not there. And Yvette is setting off to Brighton to the Labour Party conference, so she's not there. And I checked in with my in-laws, but they are in the Lake District and not around.
Right.
However, me and my 2 daughters are having roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, which I bought today at the butcher, and with some parsnips and Yorkshire puddings. And I shall, despite the Evening Standards review, I will make them with groundnut oil.
Are you?
Because there's never enough fat in the tin.
This
idea that you can sort of pour the fat off a beef joint. These days, there's never enough fat. So a little bit of oil is fine. A little bit of
groundnut oil.
It's fine. The one thing I can guarantee you about the Yorkshire puddings recipe in the book is they always work.
Okay.
Every time. And they're better than frozen ones.
Okay. You might get some people out here challenging, going, no, mine are better. My husband's sitting there going,
no, but they definitely work. I'm not saying they're the best. I certainly, look, I'm not a chef, and I'm definitely not going to claim that these are the best recipes, but they are good recipes and they work.
Yeah. Well, I'll look forward to my invite round for Sunday lunch.
The hardest thing I had, I did Best Home Cook. It's not Master Chef.
Yeah.
It's Best Home Cook.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to produce a recipe, like my mum's lasagna, kind of roast chicken. And you're facing Mary Berry
Terrifying.
and Angela Hartnett, and she's about to say, potentially, this is not a good lasagna. And what do you say? I say, I'm really sorry, Mary. It's my mum's lasagna.
Yeah.
It's what it is.
Deal with it.
Deal with it. I mean,
You've
actually,
liked it for years.
the home cook doesn't want to do the best or the authentic.
No.
What they want to do is the one they know
their
they
family
want
likes.
at home.
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about.
Yeah,
and
it is.
so all I'm doing here really is sharing the recipes I've learnt in my life from my mum and other places, which are the ones where our kids will say, cook it that way.
Yeah.
That's all it
everyone
is. I don't
has
claim
those
anything more than
recipes
that.
at home as well. Thank you so much, Ed Balls, for spending some portion of your very busy Saturday night with us. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy your musical and your dinner out tonight.
I know.
And thank you, everybody, for coming along. And we hope we get another Strictly tour out of you at some point.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.